They said the widow had nothing left worth saving. So why did a stranger risk everything just to leave something behind? The wind moved slow across Red Hollow, carrying dust that tasted like old wood and regret, the kind that settled into your bones and never quite left. And at the far edge of town, past the last fence post that still stood straight, Margaret Hale kept her eyes on the ground as she walked, because looking up meant seeing what she was about to lose, and she wasn't ready for that yet. Not today. Not with only 3 days left before the bank men came with their papers and their quiet voices and their clean boots that never touched dirt long enough to understand it. Her house leaned slightly to the west now, the porch creaking under every step like it was remembering better days, and the barn behind it stood half-shadowed, empty except for old hay and colder nights than any woman should face alone. People used to stop by once, years ago, when her husband was still alive and laughter had a place at that table. But now they passed her by like she was already gone, like poverty was. Something you could catch if you stood too close, and Margaret didn't blame them. Not anymore. She had learned that out here, survival didn't leave much room for kindness. Not when winter was coming and would cost more than pride. She reached her door just as the sun dipped low, turning the sky a dull orange that made everything look like it was already fading. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pushed it open, not from fear, just from the cold that had been settling in earlier each night. And then she heard it, a sound behind her, not loud, not urgent, just a shift in the quiet, like something breathing where nothing should be. She turned slowly, her boots scraping against dry dirt, and there he was, leaning against the edge of her barn like he'd been holding himself up for miles, a man with dust on his coat and exhaustion written into the way he stood, his hat pulled low, his face half hidden, but even from where she stood, she could see the way his shoulders carried weight, not just from the road, but from something older, something quieter. He didn't speak right away, just looked at her, and in that look there was no demand, no threat, just a kind of tired honesty that made her hesitate for a moment longer than she expected. Most people would have turned away, closed the door, pretended they hadn't seen him, and maybe Margaret would have too, if it had been a different year, a different life. But something in the stillness between them felt familiar, like standing at the edge of a choice you already knew you'd make. She stepped off the porch, the wood creaking behind her like it didn't agree, and stopped a few feet from him, close enough now to see the worn edges of his coat, the way his hands hung loose at his sides, not reaching, not asking, just there. "You're not from around here," she said, her voice quiet but steady. The man gave a small nod, barely more than a shift of breath. "Name's Elias," he said after a moment, his voice rough, like it hadn't been used for anything but survival in a long time. Margaret looked past him at the open barn, then back at his face, and something inside her settled. Not relief, not fear, just a decision. "You can have the barn," she said. Simple as that. No conditions, no questions, just an offer that didn't make sense in a place like this anymore. Elias blinked once, like he wasn't sure he heard right, and she added, almost to herself, "It's warmer than dying outside." The wind picked up just enough to carry the sound away, but not before it landed between them, and in that moment, neither of them knew that this quiet exchange, this small act in a forgotten corner of a dying town, was about to change everything Margaret thought she had already lost. Margaret did not wait for thanks, and she did not offer comfort beyond what was needed, because out here kindness was something you gave once and never spoke of again. She turned back toward the house, leaving the barn door open behind her, and for a long moment Elias did not move, like a man unsure if the ground beneath him would hold. Then slowly he stepped inside. The scent of old hay and dry wood wrapping around him as the last light of day slipped through the broken slats. Margaret stood by her window watching without making it obvious, her hands resting on the edge of the worn table where 2 plates used to sit instead of 1. She told herself it was just for the night, just until the cold passed or the man found his strength again. Nothing more than that. But something in the quiet felt different, like the house itself was holding its breath. Later that evening, she brought out a small bundle of blankets, the kind she had been saving for deeper winter, and walked halfway to the barn before stopping, reconsidering, then continuing anyway. She set them just inside the door without stepping fully in. "There is water in the bucket and some bread on the crate," she said, her voice steady but distant. Elias nodded once, not stepping closer. not reaching, just acknowledging in a way that felt heavier than words. "That is more than enough," he replied, and there was something in his tone that made her pause, not gratitude exactly, but recognition, like he understood the cost of what she was giving. Margaret turned back toward the house without another word, her boots pressing soft into the dirt that had not seen rain in weeks. That night the wind picked up stronger than before, rattling the loose boards of the barn and slipping through the cracks of the house like a quiet warning. Margaret sat by the dim light of a lantern, mending an old shirt that no one would wear, her fingers moving out of habit more than purpose. Every now and then she glanced toward the window where the barn stood, in shadow, expecting trouble, expecting noise, expecting something that would prove the neighbors right. But nothing came, only the steady sound of wind and the distant creak of wood. Sometime before dawn, she drifted into a shallow sleep in her chair, and when the first pale light touched the horizon, she woke to a silence that felt heavier than the night before. She stepped outside, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders, the air sharp and cold against her skin. The barn door was still open, just as she had left it, but the space inside felt different, emptier somehow. Elias Boone was gone, no tracks leading away that she could see clearly, just the faint disturbance of dirt where he had stood. She walked a few steps inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The blankets she had left were folded neatly on the crate, the water bucket half full, untouched more than it should have been, and for a moment she felt something she had not expected, not relief, not regret, but a quiet question that settled deep in her chest. Why would a man leave without taking anything when he had nothing to begin with? She turned to step back out when her boot caught slightly on the edge of a loose board. Beneath the hay, just enough to make her pause. She looked down, frowning, but the thought passed quickly. There were more important things waiting, letters on the table, days running out, and no place left to turn. So she left the barn as it was, never knowing that the only thing Elias Boone had truly taken with him was his own silence, and the only thing he had left behind had not yet begun to reveal itself. The letter on Margaret's table had not moved since the night before, but it felt heavier now, like paper could carry weight when it held the end of something. She stood over it without sitting down, her fingers brushing the edge but never opening it again because she already knew what it said. She had read it enough times to hear the words without looking. 3 days had become 2, and 2 would become 1 whether she was ready or not. Outside the wind had settled into a colder silence, the kind that came before frost claimed the ground. She stepped onto the porch and looked out across the small stretch of land that had once been enough. The fence Elias had touched the night before stood straighter now, the broken post reset with a precision that did not belong to a man passing through. She had not asked him to fix anything. He had not asked permission, and somehow that made it matter more. Margaret walked toward the barn again, slower this time, her boots pressing into the same dirt, but noticing different things. The way the gate no longer dragged when it opened, the way the loose hinge no longer cried out. Small things, quiet things, the kind no one would see unless they had been living with the broken version long enough to recognize the difference. She stepped inside and let her eyes move across the space. The hay had been shifted, not cleaned, not arranged, just moved with purpose, like someone had been looking for something or making room for something unseen. She crouched near the crate where she had left the bread, the folded blankets still resting there untouched, and for a moment she let herself imagine that he might come back, not because she needed him, but because unfinished things had a way of lingering in places like this. Her hand rested against the wooden floor, and that was when she felt it again, that slight give beneath the surface, not enough to break, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. Margaret pressed her palm down slowly, testing the weight. The board shifted a fraction, then settled back like it was hiding something it did not want to reveal too quickly. She pulled her hand away, her breath catching not from fear, but from something quieter, something closer to recognition. Out here, nothing was ever built without a reason. Nothing was ever left unfinished without intent. She stood up slowly, her eyes scanning the barn as if the answer might be written somewhere in the grain of the wood. But the space remained silent, holding its secret like it had been waiting for the right moment. Margaret stepped back toward the door, her mind already pulling her away, reminding her of the letter, the days, the inevitable end that was closer than anything hidden beneath a floorboard. She could not afford to chase questions that did not promise survival. Not now. Not when every hour mattered. And yet as she reached the threshold she paused, just for a second, her hand resting on the doorframe worn smooth by years of use. She looked back once more at the spot where the wood had shifted, and for reasons she could not explain, she did not step forward. She did not pry it open. She did not search for answers that might change everything. Instead, she walked away, leaving the barn quiet. Again, leaving the secret exactly where it had been placed, waiting, not for curiosity, but for necessity, because sometimes the truth does not reveal itself when you are looking for it. Sometimes it waits until you have nothing left but the need to find it. By the time the sun reached its highest point the next day, the sound came from the road long before the men appeared. Slow hooves pressing against dry earth, steady and certain, the kind of sound that did not rush because it did not need to. Margaret was already standing on the porch when they came into view. Two riders, clean coats, straight backs, their hats casting shadows that hid nothing about their purpose. She did not move to greet them, and she did not step inside. There was no use pretending she had not been expecting this moment. One of the men dismounted first, boots landing firm against the ground like he owned the dust beneath them. The other remained on his horse, watching, measuring, not unkind, just distant. "Miss Hale," the man on the ground said, unfolding a piece of paper with careful hands. "We are here regarding the property." His voice was calm, practiced, the kind that had delivered the same message more times than it could remember. Margaret nodded once. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the faint scent of dry hay from the barn behind her. "You have until the end of today," he continued. "After that, the land transfers." He did not raise his voice, and he did not need to. The words settled where they were meant to. Margaret listened without interruption, her hands resting lightly against the worn railing, her fingers tracing grooves left by years of holding on. She had imagined this moment differently. Once, thought there might be anger or pleading or some last attempt to change what had already been decided. But none of that came now. Only a quiet stillness, like the land itself had already let her go. "You can take what you are able to carry," the man added, softer this time, not out of kindness, but because it was part of the script. Margaret glanced past them toward the open stretch of dirt that led nowhere and everywhere at the same time, then back toward the barn, just for a second, her eyes resting there longer than before. The place where a stranger had stood, where something unseen still waited beneath wood that had not yet spoken. She exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to carry more than air, and stepped down from the porch, her boots landing on the ground that would no longer belong to her by nightfall. "I understand," she said, her voice steady, neither broken nor strong, just certain. The man folded the paper again, slipping it back into his coat. The conversation already finished in his mind, he returned to his horse without another word. The second rider gave a brief nod, not respectful, not dismissive, just acknowledgement between people who would not meet again. And then they turned, riding back the way they had come, leaving behind the same quiet they had arrived with. Margaret stood there long after the sound of hooves faded, her gaze fixed on the space they had occupied, as if something might return, as if time might reconsider, but nothing moved, nothing changed, only the wind, only the dust, only the slow realization that when the day ended, so would everything she had held on to. She turned. Then, not toward the house, but toward the barn, her steps measured, deliberate, each one carrying a weight she could no longer ignore, because when there is nothing left to lose, even the smallest unanswered question begins to feel like the only thing worth finding. Margaret did not rush when she stepped into the barn this time because there was nowhere left to hurry toward. The day had already taken everything it planned to take, and what remained now was quieter, heavier, something that asked for patience instead of fear. The air inside felt colder than before, not from the wind, but from the stillness that had settled after the men left. She walked to the center where the light fell through the broken slats, thin lines across the floor that pointed nowhere and everywhere at once. Her eyes found the same spot again without effort, the board that had shifted beneath her hand earlier, the place that had felt wrong in a way that did not belong to chance. She stood over it for a long moment, not moving, not bending, just listening, as if the wood might speak if she gave it enough silence. Outside, a loose hinge tapped softly against the frame. a slow, uneven rhythm, the kind that marked time. Without caring who noticed, Margaret exhaled and lowered herself carefully to one knee, her hand resting against the floor again. This time not testing, but deciding. The board pressed back slightly under her weight, not resisting, just waiting. She slid her fingers along the edge, feeling where it met the next plank. The seam was cleaner than it should have been. Too straight, too deliberate, not the work of wear or weather, but of someone who had taken the time to place it that way, someone who had known exactly what they were doing. Her fingers curled under the edge, and for a second she hesitated, not from doubt, but from the quiet understanding that whatever was beneath would not just be an answer, it would be a turning point, and once opened, there would be no going back to not knowing. The wind outside slowed, the hinge fell silent, and in that brief stillness Margaret lifted. The board came free easier than expected, not loose, but prepared, like it had been waiting for her. Hands and no one else's. Beneath it, a hollow space, small but deliberate, cut clean into the earth below, and inside, something dark, something solid, something that did not belong to a place like this. She leaned closer, her breath catching in her chest not from fear, but from the weight of possibility. Her fingers reached down slowly, brushing against cold metal, smooth, worn at the edges like it had traveled far before finding its way here. She pulled it up into the light, an iron box, no. Larger than a shoebox, heavy enough to matter, quiet enough to hide. She set it on the floor in front of her, her hands resting on either side, not opening it yet, just looking, as if the object itself might explain why it had been left, why a man with nothing would choose to leave behind something that did not belong to him. Margaret's eyes moved to the open barn door, to the empty space beyond where the road stretched out and disappeared into distance. And for the first time since the writers had come, since the letter had been read, since the days had counted down to nothing, something inside her shifted, not hope, not yet, but something close enough to feel like it might grow if given the chance. She looked back down at the box, her fingers tightening slightly against the metal lid, and in the quiet space between one breath and the next, she began to understand that the man who had said nothing, who had taken nothing, had not left empty-handed at all. He had left something behind that was never meant to be found by chance, only by someone who had run out of every other choice. Margaret did not open the box right away because some things carried more weight closed than revealed. She sat there on the cold wooden floor with her hands resting on the lid, feeling the faint chill of iron seep into her skin, as if the object itself had been waiting longer than she understood. The barn around her remained still, no wind now, no loose hinge tapping, just silence stretched thin across the space like something listening. She traced the edge of the lid with her fingers, noticing how worn it was, not from age alone, but from use, from being carried, opened, closed, moved from one place to another until it had finally been set down here, in a place no one would think to look. And for a moment, she wondered how long Elias Boone had known it would end here, how many miles he had walked with that weight hidden, not for himself, but for someone he had never met until the night before. Her breath came slow as she finally lifted the lid, careful, deliberate, like opening something that might change the shape of everything around her. Inside there was no shine at first, just folded papers tied with a thin leather cord, stacked with a precision that spoke of intention, not accident. She set the lid aside and picked them up, the texture rough beneath her fingers, older than she expected, older than anything she owned. She untied the cord and unfolded the first sheet, her eyes moving across the words slowly, not because she could not read them, but because she needed to understand them, needed to be sure they were real. It was a deed, not new, not recent, but original, bearing a name she had not seen in years, her husband's, written clearly in ink that had not yet faded. Margaret's breath caught, not sharply, but deeply, like something inside her had been pulled loose after being held too tight for too long. She turned to the next paper, then the next, each one building something she could not yet fully grasp. Records, confirmations, signatures, all pointing to the same truth. The land had never fully left her, not in the way the letter on her table had claimed, not in the way the men on horseback believed. There had been a gap, a mistake, or something more deliberate hidden in the way the claim had been processed, something that had been buried, overlooked, or perhaps ignored. Until now, beneath the papers, wrapped in a small cloth, lay something heavier. She unfolded it slowly, and the light caught it this time. Gold coins, not many, but enough to cover debts, enough to settle accounts that had been hanging over her life like a shadow she could never step out of. Margaret sat back slightly, the papers still in her hands, the coins resting in her lap, and for a long moment she did not move. She did not smile. She did not cry. She simply breathed, as if her body needed time to catch up with what her eyes had already seen. Outside the barn the light had shifted, the day moving forward whether she was ready or not. But inside, something had stopped. Something had changed direction. She looked down at the top sheet again, her husband's name steady and clear, and then, tucked between the last 2 pages, she found it. A smaller piece of paper, folded once, not official, not recorded, just a note. She held it between her fingers, feeling the difference before even opening it, knowing somehow that this was not part of the past, but part of the man who had left it behind. And as she began to unfold it, the silence in the barn seemed to deepen, like the world itself was waiting to hear what had never been said out loud. Margaret unfolded the note slowly, the paper softer than the others, worn not by time but by being handled, carried, kept close longer than something official ever would be. Her eyes moved across the first line and then stopped, not because she did not understand, but because she did. He once pulled me out of a winter that should have taken me. The words were written in a steady hand, simple, direct, the kind that did not waste space on things that did not matter. Margaret swallowed quietly, her fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the paper as she continued. Did not ask my name. Did not stay for thanks. Just left before sunrise. The barn seemed to grow quieter with each word, as if even the wood and dust were listening. Told me the same thing I am telling you now. Margaret's breath slowed, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm that felt heavier than before. You owe me nothing, she closed her eyes for just a moment, not long enough to lose the words, just long enough to feel them settle somewhere deeper than thought. When she opened them again, she continued reading. Men like him do not leave much behind, but when they do, it is never by accident. Margaret's gaze shifted slightly, almost without meaning to, toward the open barn door, toward the empty space where Elias had stood, where he had said very little and left even less behind on the surface. This land was never meant to be taken from you, not by men who read papers without knowing the hands that signed them. Margaret's fingers trembled now, not from cold, but from something building inside her, something that had been missing for longer than she realized. What is here is enough to give you back what was always yours, if you choose to use it. She looked down at the coins resting beside her, at the papers that carried her husband's name like it had never left, and for the first time since the riders had come, since the letter had been placed on her table, the end did not feel certain anymore. If you do not, then let it be buried again, and let the world move on the way it always does. Margaret exhaled slowly, her eyes lingering on that line longer than the others, because it was the only one that asked something of her, not the man who had written it, not the man who had carried it, but her. Either way, the debt is settled. Margaret lowered the note slightly, her gaze unfocused for a moment as the meaning of those words found their place. A debt she had never known existed, a choice she had not been given until now, and a future that had been decided for her until this moment. She looked back at the paper, reading the final line. Elias Boone. The name felt different now, no longer just a stranger passing through, but something tied to a past she had lived without fully seeing. Margaret sat there in the quiet, the note still in her hands, the box open beside her, and the weight of everything that had been left behind settling into the space around her. Outside, the light had shifted again, the day moving closer to its end, the time she had been given running out whether she chose to act or not. But inside the barn, for the first time in a long while, Margaret Hale was no longer standing at the edge of something being taken away. She was standing at the beginning of something that required her to decide what came next. Margaret folded the note once, then again, slower the second time, as if each crease carried a decision she could no longer delay. The barn felt smaller now, not because the space had changed, but because the silence had shifted into something heavier, something that pressed against her chest and asked for action instead of reflection. She placed the note carefully back into the box, not hiding it, not closing it away, just setting it where it could be reached again, because this was no longer about what had been left behind. It was about what she would do with it. She gathered the papers next, stacking them with a steadiness that had not been there before, her husband's name facing upward, clear, undeniable, not a memory, not a ghost, but something that still held weight in a world that had already tried to erase it. The coin she wrapped back into the cloth, her hands firm now, deliberate, no hesitation left in the way she moved. Outside, the light had begun to lean toward evening. Long shadows stretching across the dirt like time itself was running thin. Margaret stood, lifting the box with both hands, feeling its weight settle into her arms, not as a burden, but as something earned, something carried forward. She stepped out of the barn and into the fading light, the wind returning just enough to lift the edges of her shawl. But it no longer felt like something pushing her back. It felt like something at her back, steady, quiet, present. The house stood where it always had, worn but still standing, the porch waiting, the door slightly open as if it had never expected to be closed for good. Margaret crossed the distance slowly, not because she was unsure, but because each step marked a change she could feel in her bones. She set the box down on the table inside, next to the letter from the bank, the one that had carried all the certainty of her ending. And for a moment, she looked at both, the future that had been decided for her, and the one that had been placed in her hands without a word. She reached for the bank letter first, unfolding it one last time, her eyes moving across the familiar lines, but they no longer held the same weight, no longer carried the same finality. She placed it back down, not with anger, not with defiance, just with quiet understanding. Then she turned to the papers Elias had left behind, lifting them again, reading the names, the signatures, the marks that connected her past to something that had never truly been broken, only buried. The realization did not come all at once. It settled slowly, piece by piece, until it became something solid, something she could stand on. The land had not been lost, not completely, not in the way they believed. And if she moved now, if she stepped forward before the day ended, there was still time to prove it. Margaret straightened, her shoulders pulling back slightly, not in pride, but in readiness. She folded the papers carefully and tucked them into the box again, leaving the note on top, visible, as if it needed to remain there, a reminder of what had set all of this in motion. She closed the lid this time, firmly, not sealing it away, but holding it together. Then she lifted it once more, turning toward the door as the last light of the day stretched across the floor. And without looking back, Margaret Hale stepped outside, not as someone waiting to lose everything, but as someone carrying the one thing she had not had before, a choice. And for the first time since the riders had come, the end of the day did not feel like an ending at all. Margaret did not look back at the house as she stepped onto the dirt road because some things had to be left behind in order to be reclaimed. The box held firmly in both hands, not hidden, not protected, just carried with the kind of quiet certainty that did not need to explain itself. The town of Red Hollow sat a mile ahead, low buildings pressed into the earth like they had grown there instead of being built, smoke rising thin from a few chimneys. The late afternoon light turning everything the color of dust and memory. People noticed her before. She reached the first post, not because she moved fast, but because she did not slow down. A widow walking toward the bank on the last day was not something that drew curiosity. It drew expectation, the kind that assumed an ending had already been written. A man by the general store paused mid-motion. Another leaned slightly against the doorway, not speaking, just watching. Margaret passed them without a glance, her steps even, her eyes forward, the weight in her hands grounding her more than anything else could. When she reached the bank building, the door stood open, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Inside, the air felt different, cleaner, quieter, like dust was not allowed to settle here. The same man who had stood on her land earlier now stood behind the counter, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, already prepared for the final step. He looked up as she entered, not surprised, just confirming what he expected to see. "Miss Hale," he said, his tone measured. "We were not certain you would come." Margaret stepped forward, placing the box gently on the counter between them, not pushing it, not presenting it, just setting it down where it could be seen. I was not certain either, she replied, her voice steady, carrying none of the weight it had held the day before. The man's eyes shifted briefly to the box, then back to her face. Waiting, not asking, Margaret lifted the lid slowly, the soft sound of metal moving against metal filling the quiet room in a way that felt louder than it should. She did not speak as she took out the papers, unfolding them one by one, placing them on the counter in a careful line, her husband's name visible, the signatures clear, the dates undeniable. The man behind the counter leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening not from curiosity, but from something more precise, something closer to recognition. He picked up the first page, then the next, his fingers moving with practiced familiarity, but slower now, more deliberate, as if each line he read was shifting something he had already believed to be settled. The room remained silent except for the faint sound of paper turning. Margaret did not interrupt, did not explain. She simply stood there, letting the truth carry itself without her voice. After a long moment, the man set the papers down carefully, not dismissing them, not rejecting them, just placing them where they could not be ignored. His gaze met hers again, different this time, not uncertain, but no longer certain either. These documents, he began, his tone quieter than before. They suggest that the claim processed against your land may not have accounted for prior ownership. Filings. Margaret said nothing, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter, steady, patient. The man glanced again at the papers, then at the box, then back at her, and in that space between one breath and the next, something shifted in the room, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to change the direction of what was about to happen. We will need to review this immediately, he said, more to the situation than to her. Margaret gave a single nod, not in relief, not in victory, just acknowledgement, because for the first time since the letter had arrived, the ending was no longer certain, and the silence that followed was no longer empty, it was waiting. The man behind the counter did not reach for another word right away because the papers in front of him demanded more than a quick answer. His fingers rested lightly on the edges, as if holding them still would hold the truth in place. The room seemed to narrow around the space between him and Margaret, the quiet stretching longer than anyone in Red Hollow would have expected for a matter already decided. He turned one page back, then forward again, his eyes tracing the signatures, the dates. The seal pressed. Faint but still visible, something old, something that should have been seen before, and yet had not. There was a filing, he said finally, more to himself than to her. One that predates the transfer order. Margaret remained still, her hands steady against the wood, not pressing, not pulling away, just present. The man looked up at her again, and this time there was no distance in his expression, only calculation, careful and measured. If this is valid, then the claim processed against your land was incomplete. He paused, choosing his next words with precision, which means the foreclosure cannot proceed as issued. The words did not come with force, they did not need to. They settled into the room like something that had always been true, just waiting to be acknowledged. Margaret inhaled slowly, not sharply, not in surprise, just enough to feel the shift inside her chest. The man gathered the papers into a single stack, aligning them with care before setting them aside. I will need to consult the full record ledger, he continued, already turning slightly toward the shelves behind him where thick books lined the wall, each one holding names and claims and histories reduced to ink. But based on what I see here, the order placed on your property will be suspended until a full review is completed. Margaret did not speak, not yet, because the meaning of that statement was still settling, still finding its place between what had been certain and what was now possible. The man moved to the ledger, pulling it down with both hands, the weight of it landing on the desk with a soft thud. He opened it carefully, flipping through pages that whispered as they turned, stopping only when his finger found what he was looking for. His eyes scanned the lines quickly at first, then slower, more deliberate, his posture shifting again, not in doubt, but in confirmation. It is here, he said quietly, almost under his breath. The original claim was never fully transferred. He looked back at Margaret, and this time there was no uncertainty left. Miss Hale, your land is not subject to seizure under the current filing. The words hung in the air, simple, direct, final and way that the previous letter had tried to be. Margaret felt the weight in her hands lift without her moving them, like something she had been carrying had quietly been set down. She nodded once, not in gratitude, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement of something restored rather than granted. The man closed the ledger slowly, his expression settling back into the calm he had carried before, but not entirely the same. "We will issue a formal correction by morning," he added, "and ensure that no further action is taken against your property." Margaret reached for the box then, closing the lid with a soft, deliberate motion, the sound echoing lightly in the stillness. She lifted it again, holding it the same way she had when she walked in, but it no longer felt like something she was bringing to prove her place. It felt like something she was carrying because it belonged with her. She turned toward the door without another word. The man did not stop her, did not call after her, because there was nothing left to ask. Outside, the light had faded further, the sky stretching wide and open above the quiet town. And as Margaret stepped back onto the dirt road, the world did not look different. The buildings had not changed. The dust still moved the same way under her boots. But something had shifted where it could not be seen, something that did not need to be spoken, because sometimes what saves a life does not arrive with noise or force. It arrives quietly, placed beneath your feet, waiting for the moment you are ready to stand on it. Margaret walked back through Red Hollow as the last light stretched thin across the rooftops, and for the first time in a long while, no one looked at her with quiet pity or distant certainty. They looked twice, not because she had changed in any visible way, but because something in the way she moved no longer matched the ending they had already written for her. The man by the general store straightened slightly as she passed, his eyes flicking toward the box in her hands, then back to her face, searching for something he could not quite name. Margaret did not slow, did not explain, because some things did not belong to the eyes of others. Some things only revealed themselves in silence. When she reached the edge of town, the wind picked up again, softer this time, brushing against her coat like a quiet companion rather than a warning. The road stretched ahead in the same long line it always had, leading back to the house that had almost been taken from her, but now stood waiting in a different way, not as something fragile, but as something that had endured. She stepped onto her land just as the sky shifted into that deep blue that comes before night fully settles. The house stood still, unchanged, the porch worn, the door slightly open, the same as when she had left, but it no longer felt like a place she was about to lose. It felt like something that had been held in place long enough for her to return to it. Margaret climbed the steps slowly, the wood creaking beneath her boots in a familiar rhythm. She paused at the doorway, her hand resting against the frame, the grain smooth from years of passing through. And for a moment she simply stood there, listening, not for sound, but for the absence of it, the quiet that no longer felt empty. She stepped inside and set the box down on the table again, the same place it had been before, but it did not carry the same uncertainty now. It carried something steadier, something rooted. She opened it once more, not searching this time, but acknowledging, her fingers brushing over the papers, the coins, and finally the note. She lifted it carefully, reading the words again, slower this time, not because she needed to understand them, but because she wanted to remember them. Every line, every space between them, the way they had arrived without promise and left without demand. When she reached the end, she did not fold it right away. She held it there, her eyes resting on the name written at the bottom, Elias Boone, a man who had come and gone without asking for anything, without taking anything, and yet had left behind something that could not be measured in coin or paper alone. Margaret placed the note back on top of the stack and closed the lid gently, her hand resting there for a moment longer than needed, as if grounding herself in what had changed. Outside, the night settled fully, the stars beginning to show one by one above the open land. And in that quiet, Margaret Hale understood something she had not before, that what had been given to her was not just a way to keep her land, not just a correction of papers or a settling of debts. It was a return of something deeper, something she had almost forgotten how to hold. The simple, steady truth that even in a place where people learned to expect nothing, where loss came quietly and stayed, there were still moments, still choices, still people who moved through the world leaving behind more than they took. And sometimes, if you were willing to see it, That was enough to change everything without a single word being spoken. The night settled deep over the land, but Margaret did not sleep right away. She sat by the table with the lamp burning low, its soft glow resting on the worn wood and the closed iron box that now felt less like a mystery and more like a quiet promise. The house creaked gently as it always had, but tonight the sounds did not carry the same loneliness. They carried presence, memory, and something else she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. She stood after a while and stepped outside, the cold air meeting her face with a sharp clarity that pulled her fully into the moment. The stars stretched wide above her, endless and silent, the kind of sky that made a person feel small and steady at the same time. She walked slowly toward the barn, her boots pressing into the earth that had nearly been taken from her, and as she reached the doorway she paused, looking inside at the place where everything had shifted. The loose board now set back in place, the hay unmoved, the silence returned to its natural shape. But she knew better now. She knew what rested beneath that quiet surface, not just the box she had already uncovered, but the truth that had been hidden long before it was needed. Margaret stepped inside and let her hand rest against one of the wooden beams, her fingers tracing the rough grain, grounding herself in something real, something that had endured through seasons and storms and silence. She closed her eyes for a moment, not in exhaustion, but in reflection, seeing again the man who had stood here without asking, without explaining, a stranger who had carried a past into her present and left without waiting to see what it would become. She opened her eyes and looked toward the doorway, toward the empty stretch beyond, and for the first time, she wondered not what she had lost, but where he had gone, what road he had taken, and how many other places had been changed in the same quiet way. She stepped back out into the night and turned toward the house again, the lights still glowing faintly through the window, a small, steady presence in the darkness. When she reached the porch, she paused once more, her gaze moving across the land, the fence, the distant line where the road disappeared, and she realized something then, something simple but firm. This place was no longer something she held onto out of memory or obligation. It was something she chose to keep, something she would stand for, not because it had always been hers, but because she had been given the chance to claim it again. Margaret stepped inside and closed the door gently behind her. The sound soft but certain. She returned to the table and placed her hand on the box one last time before moving away, not needing to open it again, not needing to check its contents, because what mattered had already settled into place. The papers would be reviewed, the records corrected, the land restored, but those were only the visible parts, the part that remained unseen, the part that would not be written down or recorded, was the quiet exchange that had made it possible, the moment when a door had been left open, when a stranger had been given shelter without question, and something had been set into motion that no one in Red Hollow would ever fully understand. Margaret moved toward the small bed in the corner of the room and sat down, the weight in her chest lighter now, not gone, but changed, shaped into something she could carry forward instead of something that held her back. And as the lamp dimmed and the night stretched on, she did not think about the letter that had once promised an ending. She thought about the road, the man who had walked it, and the quiet truth that sometimes the most important things a person leaves behind are not meant to be seen right away. They are meant to be found only when they are needed most. Morning came slowly over Red Hollow, not with noise, but with light that settled gently across the land as if nothing had ever been at risk of being lost. The frost clung lightly to the fence Elias had repaired, each post standing firm now, no longer leaning, no longer waiting to fall. Margaret stepped out onto the porch with a steady breath, the air cold but clean, the kind that carried no weight from yesterday, only the quiet promise of what could be built from it. In the distance the road stretched the same as always, long and open, holding no sign of the man who had passed through it. No tracks, no shadow, nothing that could be followed. And yet his presence remained in the way things now stood, in the way the house felt, in the way Margaret no longer hesitated when she stepped forward. By mid-morning the rider returned from the bank, not with urgency, but with confirmation. A folded document placed into her hands with careful respect, the correction made official, the land restored fully under her name. No confusion left in ink or record. Margaret accepted it with a single nod, not needing more than that, because what mattered had already been decided before any paper was written. After the writer left, the quiet returned again, but it no longer felt like absence. It felt like space, space to live, to choose, to continue. Margaret moved through the house with a different rhythm now, not hurried, not burdened, each motion deliberate, each step grounded in something that would not be taken from her again. She opened the iron box one last time, lifting the note carefully, her eyes tracing the words she now knew by heart, not searching for meaning anymore, just holding it, acknowledging it. She folded it once more and placed it back beneath the papers, not hidden, not forgotten, just kept where it belonged. Then she closed the lid and carried it to the shelf by the window, setting it down where the light would reach it each morning, not as a reminder of what she had nearly lost, but as a marker of what had been returned. Outside, the land waited, quiet and open, the barn standing solid, the fence holding its line, the road stretching beyond it all, and Margaret stepped down from the porch once more, her boots pressing into soil that was hers again, not by chance, not by luck, but by something deeper, something that had passed through her life without asking for recognition, and had left everything changed. She paused at the edge of the yard, her eyes moving once more toward the horizon, not expecting to see him, not needing to, because some people were not meant to stay. They were meant to pass through, to set something right, and to leave before the world could ask them to explain why. Margaret turned back toward the house then, her shoulders steady, her steps certain, and as the wind moved softly across the land, carrying nothing but the sound of open space, there was no grand ending, no crowd, no moment marked by anything more than quiet understanding, just a woman standing where she belonged, a home that remained standing with her, and the simple truth settling into place like it had always been there, that out here, justice did not arrive with noise or force, it arrived in silence, carried by someone who asked for nothing and left behind everything that mattered.